Rain in the Pacific Northwest does not simply fall, it occupies space. It is a constant living entity that swallows the horizon and turns the world into a grayscale wash of slate and charcoal. Tonight was no different. The sky had been weeping since noon, a relentless driving downpour that turned the clay soil of the Green Valley construction site into a treacherous slick of mud and slurry. Most people would have been home by now, tucked away in warm living rooms with the heating turned up, watching television or arguing over bills. I was not most people. I was the man who built the living rooms. My name is Jack Carson, and I deal in foundations. In my line of work, you learn very quickly that if the footing is flawed, the house will eventually crack. It does not matter how expensive the chandelier is or how imported the marble countertops, or if the concrete beneath them is weak or uneven, the structure is doomed. It is simply a matter of time and gravity. Gravity is the only law that never accepts a plea bargain. I wiped the water from my forehead with the back of a gloved hand and adjusted the collar of my heavy waterproof jacket. It was 11:30 at night. The site was officially closed, but I had a habit of returning to inspect the work after the crew had left. We were scheduled to pour the slab for Lot 4 the next morning at 7 sharp. Lot 4 was the jewel of this development, a sprawling modern design that sat at the edge of the ravine overlooking the dark tree line. The rebar work had to be perfect. If the steel was not tied off correctly, the inspection would fail, and I would lose 3 days and $10,000. I shone my flashlight into the excavated pit. The grid of steel bars looked like a skeleton waiting for its flesh. It looked good, tight, professional. I turned to walk back to my pickup truck, which I had parked near the site entrance about 200 yards away. The only light came from the distant street lamps on the main road and the erratic sweeping beam of my flashlight. The sound of the rain was deafening, a white noise that drowned out the hum of the distant highway. It was a rhythm I found comforting. It was predictable. Then I saw something that broke the pattern. Down in the lower excavation zone for the garage of Lot 4, a shape disrupted the emptiness of the pit. It was darker than the mud and sleek. A car. My first thought was not anger, but irritation. We had teenagers in the area who liked to sneak onto the sites to drink cheap beer and vandalize the equipment. Liability was a nightmare in this state. If some kid tripped on a piece of rebar and punctured a lung, I would be the one explaining it to a judge. I gripped my flashlight tighter and began to navigate down the muddy slope, my boots squelching heavily in a mire. As I got closer, the beam of my light caught the reflection of a chrome bumper. It was not a beat-up sedan belonging to a teenager. It was a luxury vehicle, a Lexus LS. Black. Recent model. I stopped. The rain hammered against my hood. I knew that car. I knew the license plate before I even shone the light on it. It belonged to Brian Graves. Brian was my realtor, my business partner, the man who sold the houses I built. He was the smile and the handshake to my blueprint and hammer. What was Brian doing parked inside the excavation pit of an active construction zone in the middle of a torrential downpour? The car was positioned oddly nestled deep in the corner where the retaining wall met the earth bank. It was hidden from the road. It was a spot you would only choose if you did not want to be seen. I moved closer, stepping carefully over the wooden forms. The engine of the Lexus was running. I could see the faint white plume of exhaust puffing out into the cold night air, only to be beaten down immediately by the rain. The windows were dark, heavily tinted. Brian liked his privacy. He often bragged about the privacy glass, claiming it helped him close deals with high-profile clients who valued discretion. I reached the edge of the driver's side. I raised my hand to knock on the glass to tell him he was violating safety protocols, to ask him what kind of game he was playing. But my hand stopped inches from the window. A flash of lightning illuminated the sky, a stark blue-white strobe that turned the night into day for a fraction of a second. It was followed instantly by a crack of thunder that shook the ground beneath my feet. In that brief explosion of light, the tint of the window was rendered useless. I saw them. It was not a client meeting. It was not a business discussion. The passenger seat was reclined. There were two figures entangled in a way that left no room for interpretation. I saw the familiar profile of Brian, his head thrown back. And I saw the woman. Her hair was lighter blonde a shade I had paid $300 for at a salon 2 weeks ago. Melissa, my wife. The lightning faded and darkness snapped back into place, leaving me staring at the black reflective glass. I did not gasp. I did not scream. I did not feel my heart race. In fact, I felt the opposite. A strange cold numbness washed over me, starting at the base of my neck and spreading down to my fingertips. It was the same feeling I got when I found a structural crack in a load-bearing wall. It was the realization of a catastrophic failure. The foundation I had built my life upon, my marriage, my partnership, my trust, was not just flawed. It was non-existent. They were in the pit. The location was ironic. They had parked exactly where the concrete was meant to go. They were occupying the void. I stood there for a long minute. The rain ran down my face, mixing with nothing, because I was not crying. I was calculating. I looked at the car. It was heavy, nearly 2 tons of steel and leather. It was parked on soft, wet clay. The wheels had already sunk a few inches into the mud. I looked up at the slope. At the top of the ramp stood the mixer. Unit 7. It was a fully loaded concrete transport truck left overnight because of a mechanical issue with a hydraulic chute that we had fixed late this afternoon. It was loaded with 8 cubic yards of high-strength, quick-setting mixture meant for the early morning pour. The drum was set to a slow agitation cycle to keep the batch from hardening before dawn. A low hum emanated from it, barely audible over the storm. A plan did not form in my head. It arrived fully formed, like a blueprint unrolling on a table. I did not knock on the window. I did not confront them. A confrontation is a messy thing. It involves shouting and lies and emotional displays. I had no interest in emotions. I was interested in correction. I was interested in containment. I turned around and walked back up the muddy ramp. My movements were steady. I climbed into the cab of the cement mixer. The interior smelled of diesel and stale coffee. I turned the key and the massive diesel engine roared to life. The vibration traveled up through the seat and into my spine. It felt grounding. I released the parking brake and shifted the truck into gear. The headlights cut through the rain, illuminating the scene below. The Lexus was still there, rocking slightly. They were so consumed with each other that they hadn't even noticed the roar of the heavy machinery or the lights. Or perhaps they thought it was just a passing truck on the road. I maneuvered the massive vehicle down the slope. It was a tricky descent, especially in the mud, but I had been driving these trucks for 20 years. I knew exactly how they handled. I backed the truck up, positioning the rear chute directly over the Lexus. I engaged the PTO, the power takeoff unit that controlled the drum and the chute. I swung the chute, explicitly aiming it. I was not aiming for the sunroof. I was not aiming to crush them. That would be messy. That would be violence. I was aiming for the perimeter. I pulled the lever to reverse the drum direction. The sound of concrete sliding down a steel chute is distinct. It is a wet, heavy, slithering sound like a landslide in miniature. The first wave of gray slurry hit the ground right against the driver's side door. It splashed up, coating the glass. I watched in the side mirror. The car stopped rocking instantly. I kept the lever pulled. The concrete flowed, thick and relentless. It was a special mix reinforced with fiber for extra tensile strength. It piled up against the door, rising to the handle in seconds. I adjusted the chute, swinging it around the front of the car, burying the grille and the headlights. Inside the car, there must have been panic now. I imagined the sudden darkness as the headlights were covered. The realization that the sound outside was not rain, but something much heavier. I moved the truck slightly forward and swung the chute to the passenger side. More concrete. Tons of it. It flowed around the rear wheels, encasing the exhaust pipes. The engine of the Lexus choked. With the exhaust blocked, the back pressure would kill the motor within seconds. The lights of the car flickered and died. Now they were in total darkness. I continued to pour until the drum was empty. The car was not buried. The roof was visible. The windows were mostly clear, although splattered. But the doors were sealed behind a wall of gray sludge that was rapidly settling. The wheels were cemented into the earth. The exhaust was plugged. The air intake was blocked. It was a perfect containment. I disengaged the PTO and let the truck idle for a moment. The silence from the pit was absolute. The heavy layer of concrete acted as a sound insulator. They could be screaming their lungs out in there, and I would hear nothing over the rain and the diesel engine. I checked my watch. 11:45. The entire operation had taken less than 15 minutes. I drove the empty mixer back up the ramp and parked it in its original spot. I climbed out and walked back to the edge of the pit to inspect the work. The Lexus sat in the center of a gray lake. The concrete was already beginning to find its level. It was halfway up the doors. The pressure of the material would make opening those doors physically impossible. Even if they could unlock them, the weight of thousands of pounds of wet cement pressing against the metal would hold them shut better than any lock. I took out my phone. I did not take a picture. That would be evidence of malice. Instead, I shone my flashlight one last time. I could see faces pressed against the glass now. Pale, ghostly shapes. Hands slapping against the window. They looked small, insignificant. I felt a profound sense of closure. The variable had been isolated. The instability had been shored up. I walked to the site entrance. There was a pallet of cinder blocks nearby. I used the forklift, which was parked by the trailer, to move the pallet directly across the entrance of the construction site, blocking the only way in or out for a vehicle. Then I placed a few traffic cones and a sign that read "Danger, keep out deep excavation." I did everything by the book. I secured the site. I got into my pickup truck. The heater was still warm. I turned on the radio. Soft jazz was playing. I drove home. The drive was uneventful. The windshield wipers beat a steady rhythm. When I arrived at the house, it was dark and empty. It felt larger than usual. I went inside and locked the door behind me. I took off my wet boots and placed them on the mat. I hung on my jacket. I went into the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water. I stood by the window looking out at the backyard. The rain was still falling. I thought about the chemistry of concrete. It is an exothermic reaction. As it hardens, it generates heat. They would be warm enough for a while. The car was airtight enough to be uncomfortable, but the ventilation system usually had passive intakes that would prevent suffocation as long as the engine wasn't spewing carbon monoxide, which it wasn't because it had stalled. They would not die. They would just be very uncomfortable and very stuck. They would have a long time to talk. A long time to think about the foundation of their relationship. I took a shower. I scrubbed the smell of the site off my skin. I put on clean pajamas. I lay down in bed on my side of the mattress. The sheets were cool. I fell asleep almost instantly. The morning came with a piercing brightness that hurt the eyes. The storm had passed, leaving the sky a washed-out, innocent blue. I woke up at 6. I followed my routine. Coffee black. 2 slices of toast. I reviewed the blueprints for the next project, a commercial plaza downtown. At 7:15, my phone rang. It was my foreman, Mike. "Jack, you need to get down here," Mike said. His voice was high-tight with panic. "What is it, Mike?" I asked, keeping my voice level. "Is there a problem with the rebar?" "No, boss." "It is. There's a car. In the foundation. Someone is inside." "It is." "Jesus, Jack, it is completely poured in. We can't get them out. The cops are already here." "I see," I said. "I will be there in 10 minutes. Don't touch anything. We don't want to compromise the integrity of the pour." I hung up. I finished my coffee. I put on my work clothes. I drove to the site. The scene was chaotic. Blue and red lights flashed against the morning sun. A fire truck was parked at the entrance, the crew struggling to move the pallet of cinder blocks I had placed there. I parked on the street and walked up. A police officer intercepted me. He was young, looking tired. "So you can't be here. This is a crime scene." "I'm the owner of this property," I said. I was called by my foreman. "What is going on?" The officer blinked, looking at my calm demeanor. He gestured towards the pit. I walked past him before he could stop me. A crowd had gathered. My crew, the firemen, police. They were all looking down into the pit. The concrete had set. It wasn't fully cured, obviously. That takes 28 days, but it was hard enough to walk on. The Lexus looked like a fossil encased in sedimentary rock. It was trapped mid-wheel. The gray surface was smooth, broken only by the sleek black roof of the car. Firefighters were down there with hydraulic rescue, tools, the jaws of life. The noise of the metal cutter gnawing at the roof of the expensive car was screeching and violent. They peeled the roof back like the lid of a sardine can. I watched as they pulled Brian out first. He looked terrible. His suit was rumpled, his face pale and covered in sweat. He was shivering violently. He looked small. When they pulled Melissa out, she was weeping, hysterical. Her makeup was smeared across her face. She looked around wildly until her eyes locked onto me. She screamed. It was a raw, primal sound. "He did this. He did this." Every head turned towards me. A detective in a cheap trench coat approached me. He had been watching me watch them. "Are you Jack Carson?" he asked. "I am. Your wife claims you trapped them there." I looked at the detective, then I looked at the car. "That is my wife?" I asked. My voice was genuinely flat. I thought she was at her mother's. "Don't play games with me, Mr. Carson. Did you operate the mixer last night?" "I was here last night, yes," I said. "I came to secure the site. We had a poor schedule for this morning. I prepared the area." "You prepared the area by burying a car in concrete?" I looked him in the eye. It was raining, detective. A monsoon. Visibility was zero. I saw a vehicle parked illegally in the excavation pit. It happens. Kids joyriders. I assumed it was abandoned. I assumed it was dumped there to sabotage my schedule. I made an executive decision to secure the foundation. I did not see anyone inside. "You didn't check?" "The windows are tinted," I said, pointing to the shattered glass. "And it was night, and I was working alone. I am a builder detective, not a parking attendant. If you park in a construction zone, you accept the risks." Melissa was screaming again, pointing a shaking finger at me as the paramedics loaded her onto a stretcher. He knew. He looked right at us. The detective sighed. He looked at the massive, solid block of concrete. He looked at me. "Mr. Carson, I'm going to have to ask you to come with us." "Am I under arrest?" "For now, let's call it detainment, pending an investigation into—" He paused, searching for the right word. "Unlawful imprisonment. And possibly assault." I nodded. I held out my hands. I did not resist. There was no need to resist. The facts were on my side, or at least the version of the facts that could be proven. As they led me to the patrol car, I looked back at the site. The foundation for Lot 4 was ruined. It would cost thousands to jackhammer that car out and redo the work. But as I watched the paramedics cover Brian with a thermal blanket, I realized that some things are worth the expense. The structure of my life had collapsed, yes, but the demolition was controlled, and I was the one holding the detonator. I sat in the back of the police car. The plastic seat was hard. The officer got in the front and adjusted the mirror to look at me. "Rough night?" he asked. I looked out the window at the passing scenery. The sun was shining. The world looked clean. "Not really," I said. "I got a solid 8 hours." The car pulled away, leaving the chaos behind. I closed my eyes and began to draft the legal defense in my head. Step 1, establish the hazard. Step 2, deny the intent. Step 3, dismantling the opposition. The concrete was already hardening, and so was I. I spent the ride to the precinct observing the infrastructure of the city. Bridges, roads, retaining walls. People take them for granted. They think the ground beneath their feet is solid because it has always been there. They do not realize that everything is artificial. Everything is built, and anything that is built can be unmade. When we arrived at the station, I was processed. Fingerprints, mugshot, the orange jumpsuit. It was all procedural. I treated it like a site inspection. Necessary steps to reach the final certificate of occupancy. I was placed in an interrogation room. It was a small square room with a table and 2 chairs. A mirror on one wall. I knew there were people behind it, watching, analyzing. I sat down and folded my hands on the table. I sat perfectly still. I did not fidget. I did not ask for water. I waited. After an hour, the door opened. The detective from his site walked in carrying a file. He sat down opposite me and threw the file on the table. "You have a serious problem, Mr. Carson," he said, leaning forward. I looked at him calmly. "No, detective," I said. "I have a solution. The problem was the car in my pit. I solved it." He stared at me, trying to find a crack in the facade, trying to find the jealous husband, the rage, the madness. He would not find it. "They say you try to kill them," he said. "If I wanted them dead," I said softly, "I would have used the compactor. Or I would have simply filled the car through the sunroof. I left the ventilation clear. I blocked the doors. That is not murder, detective. That is a timeout." The detective blinked. "You're a cold son of a bitch, aren't you?" "I'm a pragmatist," I replied. "Now I would like to call my lawyer. I believe his number is in my phone, which you confiscated. His name is Alan Miller. Tell him I need him to bring my suit. I have a feeling I will be in court soon." The detective stood up, shaking his head. He walked to the door and stopped. "You know they're going to come for you, right? Your wife. That guy. They're going to ruin you." I allowed myself a very small, very faint smile. "Let them try," I said. "They're stuck in the mud, detective. I am the one pouring the concrete." The door closed. I was alone again in the silence. I closed my eyes and listened to the hum of the ventilation system. It was a good sound, a steady sound, the sound of a system working exactly as it was designed to. The architecture of a jail cell is designed to strip a man of his perspective. The walls are too close to the ceiling, too low the light, too artificial. It is a space built to compress the human spirit, to squeeze the defiance out of you through sheer geometric boredom. I sat on a metal bunk, counting the rivets in the steel frame of the bed opposite me. 112. I had counted them 4 times. It was a way to keep my mind calibrated. Outside these walls, the world was spinning into a chaotic frenzy of accusations and moral outrage. But in here, time had the consistency of wet mortar. It was heavy and slow. My lawyer, Alan Miller, arrived 3 hours after my processing was complete. Alan was a man who looked like he had been constructed out of old leather and pipe tobacco smoke. He was not a tall man, but he occupied space with a density that made him impossible to ignore. He wore suits that were expensive but perpetually rumpled, suggesting a man who was too busy fighting to worry about an iron. He sat down at the small metal table in the interview room and opened his briefcase. He did not look at me with pity. He looked at me with the critical eye of a structural engineer assessing a bridge that had just survived an earthquake. "You have made quite a mess, Jack Allen," said his voice a gravelly rumble. "The district attorney is looking at this file and drooling. They want to paint you as the villain of the century, the jealous husband who went medieval on his cheating spouse. They're throwing around words like premeditation and malice." I leaned back against the cold concrete wall. Let them paint Alan. Paint is just a surface treatment. It peels. What are the charges? Currently, they're holding you on reckless endangerment and unlawful imprisonment, Alan said, flipping through a stack of papers. They want to upgrade it. The prosecutor is talking about attempted heavy harm. They are arguing that sealing someone in an airtight vehicle is tantamount to suffocation. The vehicle was not airtight. I corrected him calmly. The intake valves for the climate control system are located at the base of the windshield, which I left clear. The engine was stalled, so there was no carbon monoxide risk. It was uncomfortable, yes, but it was not lethal. I calculated the variables. Alan looked at me over the rim of his glasses. Jack, you need to stop talking like an engineer and start thinking like a defendant. The jury is not going to care about intake valves. They're going to see a picture of a luxury car turned into a concrete tomb, and they're going to see a monster. We have a bail hearing in an hour. I can get you out, but it's going to be expensive. And I need you to keep your mouth shut. No more witty remarks about site safety. You are a grieving husband who made a terrible mistake in the dark. Do you understand? I nodded. I understood the role. I was being asked to play a character in a drama I had not written, but I knew how to follow a blueprint. The courtroom was a theater of wood paneling and solemnity. The judge was a woman with a face like chiseled granite who looked at me with open disdain. The prosecutor, a sharp, ambitious man named Sterling, painted a vivid picture. He described the terror of my wife and her lover, trapped in the darkness, the claustrophobia, the impending sense of doom. He used words like sadism and calculated cruelty. When it was Alan's turn, he stood up slowly. Your Honor, my client is a man of unblemished reputation. He is a pillar of the business community. He owns a construction company that employs 50 people. On the night in question, he was securing a hazardous work site during a severe storm. He admits to a lapse in judgment regarding the inspection of the vehicle, but he vehemently denies any intent to harm. He believed the car was abandoned. He is not a flight risk. His entire life is built into the soil of this county. The judge set bail at $500,000. It was a staggering amount designed to hurt. I posted it using the equity in the Commercial Plaza project. As I signed the papers, I felt a strange sense of detachment. Money is just a resource. It is fuel. And right now I was burning it to buy time. Walking out of the courthouse was like stepping into a riot. The press had gathered at the bottom of the steps, a seething mass of cameras and microphones. As soon as I pushed open the heavy oak doors, the flashbulbs erupted like a strobe light. The questions came in a wall of noise. Mr. Carson, did you enjoy watching them suffer? Jack, do you have anything to say to your wife? Are you a psychopath, Mr. Carson? I put on my sunglasses. I did not stop. I did not flinch. I moved through the crowd like an icebreaker moving through a frozen sea. Alan walked beside me, his hand on my elbow guiding me toward the waiting black sedan. I saw the faces of the reporters. They were hungry. They smelled blood in the water. To them, I was not a man. I was a headline. I was the concrete husband. It was a narrative that sold papers. I got into the car, and the silence of the interior was a relief. Alan exhaled a long breath. Don't check your social media, Jack, he advised. Just don't. I did not have social media. I said watching the city pass by through the tinted window is a waste of time. Good. Keep it that way. Go home. Stay inside. I will handle the press. We have a lot of work to do. When I arrived at my house, it felt different. It was the same structure, the same walls, the same roof, but the atmosphere had changed. The air inside was stale. I walked into the living room. Melissa's presence was everywhere. Her magazines on the table, her throw pillows on the couch, her scent lingering in the air. But she was gone. She was currently in a private hospital suite paid for by her parents, giving exclusive interviews about her trauma. I went to the kitchen and made coffee. I sat down at the island and opened my laptop. I needed to assess the damage. The damage was catastrophic. My email inbox was full of cancellations. Suppliers were putting orders on hold. Clients were asking for assurances that the company would remain operational. But the biggest blow came from the bank. There was a notification from my primary lender. They had frozen the company's credit line. They cited a reputational risk clause and a material change in leadership stability. And then there was the lawsuit. It had been filed electronically an hour ago. Melissa Carson and Brian Graves versus Jack Carson and Carson Construction, LLC. They were seeking $15 million in damages. $5 million for property damage and loss of income, and $10 million for emotional distress, psychological trauma, and punitive damages. $15 million. It was a number designed to bankrupt me. It was a demolition order. I read the complaint. It was a work of fiction. It described Brian as a heroic figure trying to comfort a terrified woman, while a deranged madman poured industrial sludge over them. It claimed I had laughed. It claimed I had tapped on the glass and waved. Lies. All of it. But in the court of public opinion, the truth is often irrelevant. The narrative is what matters. And their narrative was compelling. I was reading the document when my phone rang. It was my office manager, Sarah. She was a good woman, loyal, but she sounded terrified. "Jack," she whispered, "Brian is here." I sat up straighter. "Brian? He is out of the hospital?" "He just walked in. He is wearing a neck brace and using a cane, but Jackie has a lawyer with him and a locksmith. They're drilling into your office door." I felt a surge of cold anger. "He is trespassing, Sarah. Call the police." I tried Jack. He showed the police a document. He says he has a right to be here. He says he is taking over. I hung up the phone. I stood up. I grabbed my keys. Alan had told me to stay home. Alan was wrong. A builder does not stay home when his site is being compromised. I drove to the office with a calculated aggression. I did not speed, but I did not yield. When I pulled into the parking lot of Carson Construction, I saw Brian's new rental car parked in my spot. The arrogance of it was breathtaking. I walked into the reception area. The office was silent. My employees were huddled at their desks, looking down, afraid to make eye contact. They were watching a power struggle, and they did not know who would survive. I walked straight to my office. The door was open. Brian was sitting in my chair. He looked ridiculous. The neck brace was a pristine white, obviously fresh from the package. He held a cane that I doubted he needed. But his face was not the face of a victim. It was the face of a man who thought he had won the lottery. Jackie said, smiling, "You're not supposed to be within 500 feet of me. Restraining order." "Get out of my chair, Brian," I said quietly. "It is not your chair anymore," he replied, leaning back and putting his feet on my mahogany desk. He picked up a document and waved it. "Read your operating agreement, Jack. Section 8. 4. In the event that the primary managing partner is incapacitated or facing criminal charges that threaten the viability of the company, the minority partner has the right to assume temporary executive control to protect the assets." I stared at him. He had actually read the contract. For years, he had never glanced at a single piece of paperwork, and now suddenly he was a scholar of corporate law. "You're not protecting the assets, Brian," I said. "You are the liability. I am the victim here, Jack." He shouted, his voice suddenly rising for the benefit of the staff outside. "You tried to bury me alive, and now I am going to bury you. I am taking control of the accounts. I am halting the projects. We need to liquidate assets to pay for the lawsuit. I'm going to sell the equipment. I'm going to sell the land. And I'm going to take every dime you have." He leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with malice. "Melissa is going to take the house. I'm going to take the company. And you're going to prison. So go ahead, Jack. Hit me. Give me one more reason to add a zero to that settlement check." I looked at him. I looked at the way he sat in my chair, the way his hand rested on my files. He was a parasite. He had fed off my hard work for years, taking his commissions, driving the cars I paid for, sleeping with the wife I supported. And now he wanted to consume the host entirely. I did not hit him. I adjusted my cuffs. "You are right, Brian," I said. "The clause exists, but it requires a majority vote of the shareholders." "I have Melissa's proxy," he smirked. "She owns 50% of your share through marital assets. We have the majority. Now get out before I call the cops and have your bail revoked." I turned and walked out. I did not look back at my terrified employees. I walked out to my truck and sat there for a moment, breathing in the smell of the leather and the rain. He had played a strong hand. He had used my own contract against me. He was trying to dismantle my life piece by piece, using the legal system as his wrecking ball. But Brian had made a mistake. He assumed that because he sat in the chair, he understood how the machine worked. He saw the company as a pile of money. I saw it as a complex system of flows and balances. And if there is one thing I know about systems, it is that if you disrupt, the flow pressure builds up, and pressure reveals cracks. I started the truck and drove not home, but to a small nondescript office building on the outskirts of the city. This was the office of Marcus Kane, my external auditor. Marcus was a man who found numbers more interesting than people. He had no social graces, but he could find a missing penny in a budget of $10 million. I walked into his office. He was surrounded by screens. Jackie said without looking up, "I saw the news. Nice work with the concrete. Always hated that guy. I need you to dig Marcus," I said, sitting down. "Dig into what?" "Into Brian. Into the accounts. He is trying to take over the company. He claims he is protecting the assets. But Brian has always lived beyond his means. The cars, the suits, the vacations. He makes a good commission, but not that good." Marcus spun his chair around. "You think he is skimming?" "I think he is a man who takes shortcuts," I said. "And now he is getting greedy. He is acting too confident. A man who is just a victim is scared. A man who is a predator is arrogant. Brian is arrogant. He thinks he is untouchable because he has the moral high ground. I want to know what is under that ground." I spent the next 12 hours in that office. We ordered bad pizza. We drank stale coffee. We went through 5 years of records. At first, everything looked clean. Brian's commissions were paid out correctly. His expenses were high, but approved. But then Marcus found it. It was a small anomaly in the supply chain. A recurring payment to a vendor called Gravel and Sand Supply Company. It was a generic name. Too generic. The payments were for aggregate material used in road base. "Wait a minute," I said, leaning closer to the screen. "We don't buy road base from third parties. We have our own quarry contract. Why are we paying this company?" Marcus clicked a few keys. "The payment started 2 years ago. Small amounts at first. 2,000 here, 3,000 there. Then they ramped up. 10,000 a month. 20,000. Who authorized these payments?" I asked. Marcus pulled up the digital signatures on the invoices. There were 2 signatures required for anything over $5,000. One was the project manager. The other was the financial officer. The project manager's signature was forged. It was a crude copy of my foreman's signature. But the second signature was authentic. It was Melissa. I stared at the screen. My wife. She had access to the accounts for household expenses and minor operational costs. She had been signing off on these invoices. Marcus traced the routing number for Gravel and Sand Supply Company. It didn't lead to a quarry. It led to a shell company registered in Nevada. And the beneficiary of that shell company? Brian Graves. I sat back in a chair. The pieces clicked into place with the satisfying sound of a heavy steel lock engaging. It wasn't just an affair. It wasn't just 2 lonely people finding comfort in each other. It was a heist. They had been stealing from me for 2 years. They had set up a fake vendor, siphoned off nearly $500,000 of company funds, and used it to fund their lifestyle. And Melissa had signed the checks. She wasn't a passive victim in a bad marriage. She was a co-conspirator in corporate fraud and embezzlement. And Brian had just walked into my office and declared himself the interim manager. He had taken fiduciary responsibility for the very company he had been robbing. A slow, cold smile spread across my face. It was the first time I had smiled in days. They had filed a civil suit for $15 million, claiming moral superiority. They were standing on a pedestal of victimhood. But they had forgotten the most basic rule of construction: never build a heavy structure on a hollow foundation. I looked at Marcus. Print it. Print everything. Jack Marcus said, looking at the total. This is grand larceny. This is federal wire fraud. If you take this to the DA. No, I said, standing up and buttoning my jacket. Not the DA. Not yet. The DA is slow. The DA is public. I don't want to just send them to jail, Marcus. That is too easy. They try to take my reputation. They try to take my business. They try to take my life. I picked up the stack of papers. They felt heavy in my hand, heavy like a weapon. I'm going to let them testify, I said. I'm going to let them stand up in court and tell the world how innocent they are. I am going to let them climb as high as they can. And then? Marcus asked. And then I am going to pull the pin. I walked out into the night. The rain had stopped, but the air was still cold. I got into my truck. I looked at the dashboard. My hands were steady. Brian thought he had checkmated me. He thought he had trapped me in a corner with his lawsuit and his takeover. But he didn't understand who he was dealing with. He was a salesman. He dealt in words and impressions. I'm a builder. I deal in reality. And the reality was that Brian Graves had just handed me the sledgehammer I needed to destroy him. I drove home, not as a defeated man, but as a general returning to his command tent. The house was still empty, but it no longer felt haunted. It felt like a staging ground. I went into the study and placed a file on the desk. I poured myself a glass of whiskey. I did not drink it immediately. I held it up to the light. They wanted a war. They wanted to drag me through the mud. Fine. I would meet them in the mud, but I would be the one bringing the concrete. The presumption of guilt was about to shift. The narrative of the concrete monster was about to collide with the hard facts of forensic accounting. I took a sip of the whiskey. It burned. It was a good burn. It woke me up. I was ready for the discovery phase. I was ready to start digging the graves they had so kindly marked out for themselves. In the construction industry, the zero cycle is the phase of work that happens below the ground level. It is the dirty work. It is the excavation, the trenching, the laying of pipes, and the pouring of footings. It is the most expensive and dangerous part of any project because you are dealing with the unknown. You are fighting against geology, against the water table, against the very earth itself. Whatever mistakes you make in the zero cycle will haunt the building forever. If you miss a measurement by an inch in the mud, it becomes a foot of error on the roof. I was currently living in the zero cycle. My life had become a series of excavations. Every day brought a new layer of dirt to the surface. I was out on bail, living in a house that felt like a museum of a failed marriage, and operating my business from a laptop on my kitchen island because my actual office was currently occupied by a usurper. Brian Graves was still sitting in my chair dictating memos and trying to sell off my heavy equipment to pay for his legal fees. He was moving fast, trying to dismantle Carson Construction before I could stop him. He was like a termite, frantic and destructive. But termites are blind. They eat and they eat, but they do not see the boot coming down. I sat in the conference room of Alan Miller's law firm. It was a sterile environment of glass and polished mahogany designed to intimidate. Alan sat at the head of the table, surrounded by stacks of files. To his right was Marcus Kane, my auditor, who looked uncomfortable in a suit. To his left was a new addition to our team, a man named Vance. Vance was a private investigator. He was a man of indeterminate age with a face that looked like it had been crumpled up and smoothed out one too many times. He did not look like a movie detective. He looked like an accountant who had seen too much. He specialized in digital forensics and surveillance retrieval. We have a strong hand with the financial fraud, Alan said, tapping the file Marcus had compiled. The embezzlement is clear. Brian and Melissa were funneling money. That gives them a motive to destroy you, and it destroys their credibility as victims. It proves they are liars and thieves. But Jacket does not get you off the hook for the criminal charges. I looked at Alan. Explain. The district attorney doesn't care if they stole money, Alan said, taking off his glasses and rubbing the bridge of his nose. The DA cares that you encased two human beings in 40 tons of concrete. The narrative is still that you were a vengeful husband who snapped. The fraud just makes you look like you had more reason to snap. They will argue that you found out about the money and that drove you to extreme measures. We need to prove that you didn't know they were in the car. We need to prove it was an industrial accident, not a calculated act of retribution. I nodded. The burden of proof. It always came back to the visibility. That is why I hired Dr. Thorne, I said. The door opened and Dr. Eris Thorne walked in. She was a forensic engineer, a specialist in optical physics and accident reconstruction. She carried a laptop and a thick binder. She did not waste time with pleasantries. I have completed the simulation, Mr. Carson, she said, connecting her laptop to the main screen. On the screen, a 3D model of the construction site appeared. It was a perfect digital replica of the pit, the ramp, and the position of a mixer. We recreated the conditions of that night, Dr. Thorne explained. We used the meteorological data from the National Weather Service. Heavy precipitation density of rain was 2 inches per hour. Cloud cover was 100%. Ambient light was negligible, only distant street lamps. She clicked a button. The screen went dark, simulating the night. Then we factored in the vehicle. A Lexus Aisha. We analyzed the window tint. It was an aftermarket application. 5% visible light transmission. That is the legal limit for rear windows, but illegal for front side windows in this state. Brian Graves had a legal tint on his front windows. She looked at me. Combined with the refractive index of the heavy rain on the glass and the lack of internal light source inside the vehicle, the visibility from the outside looking in was statistically 0. She pulled up a graph. Even if you had pressed your face against the glass, Mr. Carson, the human, I could not have resolved shapes inside that car without a direct, strong light source pressed against the window. The flash of lightning you described would have caused a reflection, a washout effect on the wet glass rather than illumination. Scientifically speaking, it is entirely plausible, even probable, that you saw nothing but a black void. Alan leaned back, a slow smile spreading across his face. Reasonable doubt, he whispered, is not just a story. It is physics. You couldn't see them. Therefore, you couldn't have intended to trap them. It is a good start, I said, but it is defensive. I need something offensive. I need to prove that there were not just victims, but active participants in their own disaster. Vance cleared his throat. He had a voice like grinding stones. That is where I come in, he said. He slid a USB drive across the polished table. Brian and your wife were careful, Vance said. They knew you had cameras on your site. They avoided the main gate. They avoided the trailer. But they were arrogant. They forgot that you're not the only builder in Green Valley. I looked at the drive. What is on this? Lot 5, Vance said. The property next door. It is owned by a private developer, a paranoid guy from California. He hasn't started building yet, but he set up a solar-powered wildlife camera on a tree to monitor his timber. It points toward the road, but the wide-angle lens catches the edge of your excavation pit. Vance plugged the drive into the laptop. A video file opened. It was grainy black and white night vision. It showed the Lexus approaching the site. It was 11 o'clock. The rain was visible as streaks of white interference. The car stopped at the top of the ramp before driving down. Watch this, Vance said, pointing at the screen. The driver's door opened. Brian got out. He was staggering slightly. He walked to the back of the car and opened the trunk. He pulled out a bottle. Even in the grain, you could see the shape. Champagne. He got back in the car. They sat there for 10 minutes. The interior light flickered on briefly. You could see them passing the bottle back and forth. They were celebrating. Then Brian put the car in gear. He drove past the no trespassing sign. He drove right over a safety cone, dragging it under the bumper. You could see the cone getting crushed. He didn't stop. He drove straight down into the pit. Vance stopped the video. They were intoxicated, Jack, or at least drinking, and they ignored a physical barrier and a warning sign. They entered a hazardous construction zone while impaired to engage in recreational activities. Alan slammed his hand on the table. This is it. This is the golden ticket. Contributory negligence. Reckless endangerment. They created the hazard. They violated OSHA regulations, federal safety laws, and traffic laws. If they had been sober and obeying the signs, they never would have been in that hole. I watched the frozen image of Brian holding the bottle. He looked so happy, so sure of himself. He was celebrating the theft of my money, the theft of my wife. He was toasting his own cleverness. Keep this hidden, I said quietly. Alan looked at me confused. What? Jack, this exonerates you. We should give this to the DA immediately. No, I said. Not yet. If we give it to them now, the DA will just drop the charges and Brian will spin it. He will say he made a mistake, but he is still a victim. He will say I still reacted excessively. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city skyline. I want them to testify, I repeated. I want Brian to stand up in court and swear under oath that he was sober, that he was careful, that he was an innocent man attacked by a monster. I want him to commit perjury. I want him to build his tower of lies as high as possible. And then, I said, turning back to the room, we will play the tape. Alan looked at me with a mixture of fear and admiration. You are gambling with your life, Jack. No, Alan, I said. I am managing the project, and I am about to call a meeting. Set up a settlement conference. A settlement conference? Alan asked. Why? Because I want them to think I am losing, I said. I want to smell their confidence. The settlement conference took place 3 days later in a neutral ground of a mediator's office. The room was beige and smelled of stale coffee and anxiety. Brian and Melissa sat on one side of the long table. Their lawyer, a man named Sterling who wore a suit that cost more than my truck, sat between them. Brian was still wearing the neck brace. It was a proper piece of theater. He looked at me with a sneer that he didn't bother to hide. Melissa would not look at me. She stared at her hands, twisting her wedding ring, my grandmother's ring, around her finger. I sat opposite them. I wore my work clothes. Jeans, work boots, a flannel shirt. I looked tired. I let my shoulders slump. I let my hands shake slightly when I reached for the water glass. Mr. Carson, Sterling began, his voice smooth and oily. We are here because you have indicated a desire to discuss a resolution. My clients are willing to listen, but let me be clear. The trauma they have suffered is incalculable. I looked at the table. I know I said my voice low. I know it was unfortunate. Unfortunate? Brian scoffed. You buried us in cement, Jack. You tried to turn us into a statue. Please, Brian, Alan said, putting a hand on my arm. Let's keep this civil. My client is prepared to offer a financial settlement to drop the civil suit. We put the offer on the table. $2 million. It was a lot of money. It was everything I had liquid plus a second mortgage on the house. Sterling looked at the paper and laughed. It was a dry, humorless sound. $2 million? He said. Mr. Carson, that is an insult. We are asking for 15, and we want the company. I looked up. My eyes met Brian's. You want the company? I asked. It is the only way to ensure Brian is compensated for his loss of career, Brian said. My reputation is ruined because of you. No one wants to buy a house from the guy who got poured into a foundation. I need security. I took a deep breath. Brian, you don't know how to run a construction company. It is not just selling houses. It is logistics. It is liability. It is managing the zero cycle. I will figure it out, Brian said, leaning forward. I am a fast learner. Besides, I have been practically running it for the last month while you sit in jail. We are doing fine. I looked at Melissa. And you? I asked. What do you want? She finally looked up. Her eyes were hard. I want out, Jack. I want half of everything plus the settlement. I want to start over. With Brian. I looked at them. They were so greedy. They were so convinced of their own righteousness. They had no idea that the ground beneath them was already hollowed out. I cannot give you the company, I said. It is my life work. Then we will take it, Sterling said, closing his folder. We will see you in court, Mr. Carson. And when we are done, you will be lucky if you can afford a shovel to dig ditches. They stood up to leave. Brian paused at the door. You always thought you were smarter than me, Jack, he said. You always thought you were the big, strong builder, and I was just a salesman. Well, look at us now. I'm walking out and you're going down. I watched them leave. I waited until the door clicked shut. Then I straightened my back. The slump vanished. The shaking hands became steady. Alan looked at me. He wiped sweat from his forehead. That was brutal, Jack. They were going for the throat. I poured myself a glass of water and drank it calmly. Good, I said. They are overextended. They just rejected a reasonable settlement. That shows malice. It shows greed. And Brian just admitted on record that he has been running the company for the last month. So? Alan asked. So I said I checked the purchase orders this morning. The company ordered a new batch of concrete for the downtown plaza. Brian signed the order. He ordered the wrong mix. He ordered a residential grade for a commercial load-bearing wall. Alan's eyes went wide. If we pour that wall, I said, it will collapse within a year. It could kill people. I stood up. I'm going to let him pour it, I said. Jack, you can't, Alan said. That is dangerous. I will stop it before the inspection, I said. But I will let him pour it. I will let him waste $50,000 of material. I will let him prove his incompetence. And I will let him sign the safety log. We left the office. I felt a grim satisfaction. The trap was not just the camera footage. The trap was Brian's own ego. I was giving him enough rope to hang himself, and he was tying the noose with enthusiasm. The investigation continued. 2 days later, Alan called me. His voice was tight. Jack, we have a problem. A big one. I was in my kitchen reviewing the structural analysis of the Lexus. What is it? The prosecutor just sent over a discovery packet, Alan said. They analyzed the concrete from the incident, the mix you used to trap them. And? It contained a chemical accelerant, Alan said. Calcium chloride. A high dose. It is used to make concrete set twice as fast. The prosecutor is arguing that this proves premeditation to kill. They are saying you used a rapid death mix to ensure they couldn't escape even if they broke the window. They're saying you wanted them to suffocate before help could arrive. I sat there holding the phone. Calcium chloride. It heats up the reaction. It makes the concrete harden in minutes instead of hours. Jack, Alan asked, did you add the accelerant? No, I said. I used the mix that was in the truck. Unit 7. It was loaded for the morning pour. Well, someone added it, Alan said. And it looks bad. It looks like a weapon. I hung up the phone. I closed my eyes and visualized the batch ticket. Unit 7. Lot 4. Garage foundation. Why would there be accelerant in a foundation pour? You don't usually use it for foundations because it can make the concrete brittle if it cures too fast. Unless you are in a hurry. Unless you are behind schedule and you need the inspectors to sign off so you can frame the house and get the next draw from the bank. I opened my laptop. I logged into the supplier's portal. I had to bypass Brian's new password, but I knew his security questions. His mother's maiden name. His first pet. Predictable. I searched the order history for Lot 4. There it was. A change order filed 3 months ago. Add 2% calcium chloride solution to all foundation mixes for Lot 4. Priority. Expedite curing time for early framing. The signature on the change order was digital. Authorized by Brian Graves, project manager. I laughed. It was a dry, harsh sound in the empty house. Brian had been pushing the schedule. He wanted the commissions faster, so he ordered the rapid set mix to speed up the building process. He had unknowingly ordered the exact material that had trapped him. He had built his own prison. I called Alan back. Alan, I said, I know about the accelerant. Jack, please tell me you didn't do it. I didn't, I said. Brian did. He ordered that mix 3 months ago to rush the job. He wanted his money faster. There was silence on the line, then a sudden intake of breath. You can prove this? Alan asked. I have the invoice, I said. I have his signature. Alan started laughing. It was a hysterical, relieved laugh. Oh my God, he said. The prosecutor is going to walk into a buzzsaw. He's going to stand up in court and wave this deadly concrete around, and we're going to tell the jury that the victim ordered it himself? Exactly, I said. This is perfect, Alan said. But Jack, we need to be careful. We can't reveal this yet. We have to wait for the trial. We have to let the prosecutor commit to this theory. That is the plan, I said. We let them deploy their weapons, and then we show them that they're holding them by the wrong end. I hung up. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the kitchen. I thought about the nature of concrete. It is a mixture of sandstone, cement, and water. Individually, these things are weak. Sand slips through your fingers. Water flows away. But when you bind them together, they become rock. I was gathering my materials, the video footage, the financial records, the concrete invoices, the safety violations. Individually, they were just facts. But bound together, they were an argument. A concrete argument. And I was ready to pour. My phone buzzed. A text from Vance. Jack, one more thing. I did a background check on Gravel and Sand Supply Co., the shell company they used to steal the money. I found the registered address. It's an apartment in Vegas. So, I typed back. So Vance replied, the apartment is rented in the name of a woman. Not Melissa. A woman named Chloe. She's a blackjack dealer. I stared at the screen. Who is Chloe? I checked Brian's phone records, Vance wrote. He calls her every Friday night. For an hour. I put the phone down. Brian wasn't just cheating on me with Melissa. He was cheating on Melissa. He was stealing from me to support Melissa, and he was stealing from the stolen money to support a girl in Vegas. The complexity of his betrayal was almost architectural. It was a multi-level structure of deceit, and that meant I had a new lever. Melissa didn't know. She thought they were partners. She thought they were Bonnie and Clyde. She didn't know there was a third wheel on the wagon. I walked to the window. The city lights were flickering on. I didn't just have a defense anymore. I had a detonator. If I played this right, I wouldn't just win the case. I would watch them tear each other apart in the courtroom. The zero cycle was over. We were moving to the framing, and I was going to frame them perfectly. The Superior Court of King County was a room designed to intimidate. It was a cavern of dark oak and polished brass, a space where the air itself felt pressurized. I sat at the defendant's table next to Alan Miller. My hands were folded on the surface. I was wearing my best suit, a charcoal gray, wool that scratched slightly at the neck. I felt like a building wrapped in scaffolding, trying to hide the structural work happening underneath. The gallery was packed. The press had turned this into a circus. I could feel their eyes on the back of my neck, 100 lenses zooming in, trying to catch a twitch, a bead of sweat, a sign of the monster they had invented. To them, I was not Jack Carson the builder. I was the concrete husband. I was the man who had turned a luxury car into a sarcophagus. They wanted a villain. I looked at the jury. 12 people. A school teacher. A mechanic. A retired nurse. A young man with a nose ring who looked bored. They were the soil sample. If they were stable, I would stand. If they were loose, I would sink. The prosecutor was a man named Sterling. He was theatrical. He moved around the courtroom like a dancer, his robes billowing. He did not speak, he projected. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Sterling began, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. We are here to discuss a crime of medieval cruelty. We are here to talk about a man who looked at his wife and his business partner and decided that they did not deserve to live. He did not use a gun. He did not use a knife. He used the tools of his trade. He used the earth itself to swallow them whole. He pointed a finger at me. Jack Carson is a cold man, a calculating man. He saw a moment of vulnerability, and he turned it into a tomb. He trapped 2 terrified human beings in a steel box and poured 40 tons of industrial sludge over them. He left them in the dark. He left them to suffocate. He walked away and went to sleep while they screamed for their lives. I did not react. I watched a fly buzzing against the high window pane. It was trying to get out. It didn't understand the nature of glass. The prosecution called their first witness. Melissa. She walked to the stand, looking fragile. She was wearing a modest beige dress high-necked. She looked nothing like the woman who bought designer shoes with company money. She looked like a saint who had stumbled into a nightmare. She sat down, and when she looked at me, her eyes filled with instant practice tears. Mrs. Carson, Sterling asked softly, "Tell us about that night." Melissa took a shaky breath. Brian and I, we just needed to talk. We went to the site because it was quiet. We were discussing the business. We were discussing restructuring. It started to rain. We just sat there. And then, the darkness. She paused, wiping her eyes with a tissue. I heard a noise, a rumble, and then the windows went black. I thought it was a mudslide. I screamed for Jack. I knew he was there. I could feel him. I screamed, "Jack, please stop." But the gray stuff just kept coming. It was squeezing the car. The metal started to groan. I thought I was going to die in there. I thought I would never see my mother again. The jury was captivated. The retired nurse was wiping her eyes. The young man with the nose ring was glaring at me. "Did you try to open the doors?" Sterling asked. "We tried," Melissa sobbed, "but they wouldn't move. It was like being buried alive. It was cold, so cold, and silent. We held each other and prayed." Sterling let the silence hang in the air. "Thank you, Mrs. Carson." Alan stood up. He buttoned his jacket. He looked like a weary grandfather, but I knew his mind was a razor. "Mrs. Carson," Alan said, "you stated you were there to discuss business?" "Yes." "At 11:30 at night?" "We work late." "In a construction pit? In a storm?" "It was private." Alan nodded. "And you say you screamed for your husband. Did you see him?" "No, but I knew." "You knew? Interesting." Alan picked up a piece of paper. "You testified that the car was crushed by the weight, that the metal groaned." "It did. It was terrifying." "Mrs. Carson, are you aware that the structural integrity of a Lexus LS cabin is rated to withstand a rollover impact of 5 times its own weight? The concrete exerted pressure, yes, but nowhere near enough to crush the frame. The groaning you heard was likely the suspension settling into the mud." "I felt it." She snapped. "I'm sure you felt many things," Alan said calmly. "But let us talk about why you were there. You said you were discussing restructuring. Is that why you were parked in the blind spot of the excavation zone?" "We weren't hiding." Alan paused. He walked back to the table and picked up a document. "Mrs. Carson, are you familiar with the concept of a zero cycle?" "I know. It is the phase of construction where the foundation is laid. It is dangerous. There are holes. There is rebar. It is not a place for meetings. Tell me, did you see the sign at the entrance? The one that says danger. Authorized personnel only?" "It was raining. We didn't see any signs." "So you entered a hazardous industrial site in a storm without checking for safety warnings. Is that correct?" "We are owners. We don't need permission." Alan smiled. It was a small, cold smile. "Ah, owners. So you accept responsibility for the site conditions?" Melissa faltered. She looked at Sterling, but he couldn't help her. I suppose. Thank you, Mrs. Carson. No further questions." Melissa stepped down. She looked shaken. She had expected to be coddled, but Alan had forced her to admit she was technically liable for her own presence. It was a small crack, but it was a start. Next was Brian. Brian limped to the stand. The cane. The neck brace. It was a performance worthy of an Academy Award. He sat down wincing as if his very bones were made of glass. "Mr. Graves," Sterling said, "how has this event impacted you?" Brian looked at the jury. "I can't sleep. I have nightmares. I see the gray wall coming down. I can't get into a car without shaking. My career is ruined. Who wants to buy a house from a man who is treated like garbage? Jack Carson tried to erase me. He didn't just want to hurt me. He wanted to delete me. He looked at me. His eyes were full of hate. He is a jealous, insecure man who couldn't handle that his wife was unhappy. So he tried to cement us together. Literally. Sterling walked to the evidence table. He picked up a plastic bag containing a gray rock. Mr. Graves, the forensic analysis of the concrete used that night revealed something disturbing. It contained a high concentration of calcium chloride, an accelerant. Are you aware of what that does? Brian nodded grave. It makes concrete burn. It makes it set instantly. He wanted to cook us. He wanted to make sure we couldn't escape. It was a chemical weapon. Sterling turned to the jury, holding the rock high. You heard him. Jack Carson didn't just use concrete. He laced it with a chemical agent to ensure maximum suffering. This wasn't an accident. This was a trap designed to be inescapable. The room buzzed. The jury looked horrified. The chemical weapon argument was landing. I could feel the heat in the room rising. Alan leaned over to me. Ready? He whispered. Pour, I said. Alan stood up for the cross-examination. He walked to the center of the room. He did not look at Brian immediately. He looked at the evidence bag. Mr. Graves, Alan began. You seem very knowledgeable about calcium chloride. I am in the industry, Brian said smugly. I know the materials. Excellent. Then you know that calcium chloride is typically used to speed up curing times in cold weather or when a schedule is tight. I know it can be dangerous, Brian parried. Indeed. Alan walked to the projection screen. I would like to introduce Defense Exhibit B. The screen flickered to life. It was a digital invoice. A purchase order from the concrete supplier. Mr. Graves, do you recognize this document? Brian squinted. It's an invoice. It is purchase order 804, Alan said, reading from his notes. Dated 3 months ago. It is an order for the foundation mix for Lot 4. The very foundation you were parked in. So? Brian shrugged. Jack handles the ordering. Alan zoomed in on the bottom of the document. Actually, Mr. Graves, this order was a change request. The original spec was for standard mix. But someone logged into the system and changed it to rapid set with 2% calcium chloride. Alan paused. The room was silent. And can you tell the jury whose digital signature is at the bottom of this request? Brian went pale. The neck brace suddenly seemed to choke him. I sign a lot of things. Let me read it for you, Alan said, his voice cutting through the air like a saw. Authorized by Brian Graves. Project Manager. Priority. Expedite curing time for early framing. Alan turned to the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, the prosecution claims my client used a chemical weapon to trap these people. But the evidence shows that the weapon was ordered, approved, and paid for by the victim himself. Mr. Graves ordered the accelerant because he wanted to rush the job to get his commission check faster. He turned back to Brian. You built your own trap, Mr. Graves. Jack Carson simply poured the mix you ordered. If it was dangerous, why did you order it? Brian stammered. I didn't know. You meant to cut corners, Alan said, and you ended up cutting off your own escape. Sterling jumped up. Objection. Argumentative. Sustained, the judge said, but she was looking at Brian with a new expression. Skepticism. Alan wasn't done. Mr. Graves, let's talk about the visibility. You claim Jack saw you. You claim he knew you were inside. He looked right at us. Brian insisted, trying to regain ground. The lightning flashed. He looked me in the eye. The lightning, Alan mused. Interesting. Defense Exhibit C, please. The screen changed. It was the video from the neighbor's wildlife camera. The grainy black and white footage began to play. The jury watched as the Lexus drove down the road. They saw it swerve. They saw it run over the safety cone. Mr. Graves, is that your vehicle? Yes. You seem to be having trouble driving. Was the road slippery? It was raining. Alan let the video play. The car stopped. Brian got out. He opened the trunk. He pulled out the bottle. What is that in your hand, Mr. Graves? Brian stared at the screen. He looked like a man watching his own funeral. It looks like a bottle. A bottle of water? Alan asked innocently. No. Champagne, perhaps? Don't Perignon. We found a receipt in your expenses charged to the company account. Brian was silent. So Alan continued. You were drinking. You drove past the do not enter sign. You destroyed a safety cone. You entered a dangerous excavation pit. And you parked in a blind spot. All while intoxicated. Alan stopped the video. Mr. Graves, if you were drunk and the windows were tinted and it was raining, how can you be sure Jack saw you? Or did you just assume he saw you because you felt guilty? I wasn't drunk. Brian shouted, losing his cool. I had one glass. And he knew. He called me. Alan froze. He turned slowly. He called you? Yes. Brian shouted, triumphant. He called my phone right before he poured. See? He knew I was there. He wanted to taunt me. Alan looked at me. I nodded. This was the moment. The pivot. Alan walked back to the table and picked up a phone record. We have the log here, Mr. Graves. Incoming call from Jack Carson. 11:25 p.m., 5 minutes before the pour began. He turned to the jury. If Jack Carson wanted to murder you, Mr. Graves, why did he try to call you? Brian blinked. What? If I want to trap a rat, I don't ring a bell, first Alan said. Jack Carson called you. Why didn't you answer? I was busy. Busy doing what? Brian looked at Melissa. She looked away. I didn't hear it. Alan shook his head. No, Mr. Graves. You ignored it. You ignored the safety signs. You ignored the cones. You ignored the phone call. My client tried to warn you. He tried to reach out. But you were too busy restructuring with his wife to answer the phone. Alan slammed the file shut. Jack Carson didn't trap you, Mr. Graves. You trapped yourself. You drove into a hole, you turned off your lights, and you ignored the warning call. You committed a series of safety violations that resulted in an accident. And now you want to blame the man who was just doing his job. Brian was shaking. Sweat was running down his face, pooling in the foam of his neck brace. I am a victim, he screamed. I am a victim. Alan looked at him with cold pity. No, Mr. Graves. You're just a trespasser. Alan sat down. The courtroom was buzzing. The narrative had shifted. The concrete monster was fading, and in his place was a diligent builder trying to work around two drunk, reckless fools. But we weren't done. We had one more demolition charge to set. Alan looked at the judge. Your Honor, we have one final line of questioning regarding the damages claimed by the plaintiffs. Proceed. Alan called Melissa back to the stand. She looked wary now. She's sensing that the ground was shifting. Mrs. Carson, Alan said gently, you are suing for $15 million. You claim financial ruin. Yes, we have lost everything. And you are suing for the rights to Carson Construction? It is marital property. I helped build it. Alan nodded. You helped build it. By managing the accounts? Yes. I did the books. Alan pulled out a new file. The file Marcus had compiled. Mrs. Carson, can you explain what Gravel and Sand Supply Co. is? Melissa frowned. It is a vendor. For materials. We checked the address, Alan said. It is a shell company registered in Nevada. Over the last 2 years, you signed checks totaling $400,000 to this company. Melissa went pale. Jack must have set it up. Alan shook his head. No, the signatures are yours. And the beneficiary of the account is Brian Graves. The courtroom gasped, a collective intake of breath. Melissa turned slowly to look at Brian. Brian was staring at the floor. Brian? She whispered. Alan continued, his voice relentless. You were signing checks to a fake company, Mrs. Carson, thinking you were hiding money for your future with Mr. Graves. But did you know where the money went after it hit Brian's account? We saved it. For the lawsuit. For us. Alan projected the bank statement onto the screen. This is the transaction history for the Gravel and Sand account. It shows monthly transfers to a rental agency in Las Vegas. Las Vegas? Melissa whispered. Her voice was trembling. Yes. for a luxury apartment at the Palms, and a monthly allowance of $5,000 to a Ms. Chloe Davis. The name hung in the air like smoke. Who? Who is Chloe Davis? Melissa asked, her voice breaking. Alan looked at his notes. She is a blackjack dealer at the Bellagio, and according to phone records, she speaks to Mr. Graves every Friday night. The same nights he told you he was working late on the accounts. Melissa stood up. She wasn't looking at the jury. She wasn't looking at me. She was looking at Brian. You told me we were saving for a house, she screamed. Her voice was raw, tearing through the courtroom. You told me the money was for us. Brian jumped up. Melissa, don't listen to him. It's a trick. You spent my money on a stripper. She shrieked, lunging towards him. A bailiff had to step in, holding her back. I stole from my husband for you. I ruined my life for you. And you have a girlfriend in Vegas? Order. The judge banged her gavel. Order in the court. But the order was gone. The illusion of the united victims was shattered. They were not a couple. They were two thieves who had turned on each other. Alan looked at me and sat down. He didn't need to say anything else. I watched them. Melissa was sobbing hysterically, screaming obscenities at Brian. Brian was cowering, trying to hide behind his lawyer, his neck brace askew, looking like a pathetic, broken man. The jury was watching, too. They weren't looking at a monster anymore. They were looking at a soap opera, and they were disgusted. I felt a strange calm. It was the feeling of a job well done. The feeling of seeing a structure collapse exactly as predicted because the foundation was rotten. I hadn't just defeated them in court. I had exposed the termites in the wood. The judge called for a recess. As the bailiffs led the screaming Melissa out and Brian was hustled away by his lawyer, I stayed in my seat. Sterling, the prosecutor, was packing his bag. He looked defeated. He knew his case was dead. You can't convict a man for trapping two people who broke and got drunk, ignored safety warnings, and were busy stealing from each other. The malice was gone. Now it was just a farce. Alan turned to me. That went well, he said dryly. I looked at the empty witness stand. It went according to plan, I said. The crossfire was over. The smoke was clearing, and I was the only one left standing. But there was one more thing to do. One final act. I looked at the phone on the table. The record of the call. 11:25 p.m. Alan had asked Brian why he didn't answer, and Brian had said he was busy. But I knew the truth. I remembered that night. I remembered sitting in the cab of the mixer. I remembered dialing the number. I remembered watching the car. I saw the brake lights flash when the phone rang. He had seen it. He had rejected the call. He had chosen to ignore me. He had chosen his arrogance over his safety. And that was why I poured. Not because of the affair. Not because of the money. But because of the disrespect for the protocol. In my world, you answer the call. You check the warnings. If you don't, you get buried. I stood up. Let's go, Alan, I said. I have a company to take back. We walked out of the courtroom. The press was still there, but the energy had changed. They weren't shouting accusations anymore. They were shouting questions about the Vegas girl, about the money. Mr. Carson, did you know about the embezzlement? Mr. Carson, is it true your wife funded a mistress? I put on my sunglasses. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The concrete had set. The argument was solid. And tomorrow I would start the demolition of what was left of their lives. The jury room door opened, and the sound of the latch clicking echoed through the silence of the courtroom like a hammer striking a nail. It was a heavy, decisive sound. The 12 men and women filed out. They did not look at the gallery. They did not look at the prosecutor. They looked at the floor or straight ahead, walking with the stiff posture of people carrying a heavy load. In my line of work, you learn to read signs. You look for the hairline cracks in the plaster that indicate a shifting foundation. You listen for the groan of timber under stress. In a courtroom, you look at the eyes. If the jurors look at the defendant, it is usually good news. It means they see you as a person, not a problem to be disposed of. If they refuse to look at you, it means they have already buried you. I sat perfectly still. My hands were clasped on the table. Beside me, Alan Miller was vibrating with a low-frequency nervous energy. He was clicking the top of his pen, repeatedly a rhythmic ticking that matched the clock on the wall. "Stop it," I whispered. He stopped. "Sorry," he breathed. "It is the waiting. It kills you." "It does not kill you," I said. "It cures you. Like concrete. You just have to wait for the set." The judge entered her robes, flowing like a dark cloud. Everyone stood. The bailiff called the room to order. We sat. The air conditioner hummed a low industrial drone that did nothing to cool the heat of the moment. "Mr. Foreman," the judge said, her voice devoid of emotion, "have you reached a verdict?" The foreman was the mechanic, a man with grease-stained hands that he had scrubbed raw. He stood up. He held a piece of paper. His hand was steady. "We have, Your Honor. Publish the verdict." He unfolded the paper. I watched the crease in the page flatten out. "In the matter of the state versus Jack Carson on the charge of reckless endangerment, we find the defendant not guilty." A gasp rippled through the room. It was not a cheer, but a release of breath. I felt a muscle in my jaw relax. One pillar stood. On the charge of unlawful imprisonment, the foreman continued, "We find the defendant not guilty." Sterling, the prosecutor, closed his eyes. He dropped his pen on the table. He knew it was over. "On the charge of assault in the second degree, we find the defendant not guilty." The foreman looked up. He finally looked at me. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was one working man acknowledging another. He understood. He understood that you do not walk onto a job site without safety gear. He understood that if you ignore the signs, you accept the consequences. The judge nodded. "Members of the jury, the court thanks you for your service. You're dismissed." She turned her gaze to the other table, to the plaintiffs. Brian was staring at the wall, his mouth slightly open, as if he could not process the data. Melissa was looking at her lap, her face a mask of shock. They had come here expecting a coronation. They had expected the world to weep for them. Instead, the world had looked at their choices, their greed, and their deceit, and it had turned its back. "Mr. Sterling," the judge said, "regarding the civil suit attached to this case, given the testimony regarding the plaintiff's criminal conduct, the embezzlement, and the gross negligence on the construction site, I am dismissing the civil claim with prejudice. There will be no damages awarded." She paused and leaned forward. "And Mr. Graves, Mrs. Carson, I strongly suggest you remain in the state. I believe the district attorney will be very interested in the evidence presented by the defense regarding the fraudulent shell company in Nevada. You're no longer the victims here. You are the suspects." She banged the gavel. It was a sharp final sound, the sound of a project being signed off. "Court is adjourned." Alan let out a long breath and slumped back in his chair. "We did it, Jack. We actually did it. Clean sweep." I stood up. I smoothed the wrinkles in my suit. I did not feel elation. I felt the satisfaction of a balanced equation. The load had been calculated, the supports had held. I turned to look at them. Brian was trying to stand up, but his cane slipped on the polished floor. He stumbled, grasping at the table. He looked pathetic. The arrogance that had fueled him for years was gone, drained away like water from a cracked pipe. He looked at me, and for the first time I saw genuine fear. Melissa stood up slowly. She looked at Brian, then she looked at me. Her eyes were red-rimmed. She opened her mouth to speak, perhaps to apologize, perhaps to beg. I did not give her the chance. I turned my back on them. I walked out of the courtroom into the blinding flash of the cameras. I did not stop for the reporters. I did not give a quote. I walked straight to my truck. I got in. I started the engine. The rumble of the diesel was the only conversation I needed. The weeks that followed were a study in demolition. When you tear down a building, you do not just swing a wrecking ball. That is for the movies. In reality, demolition is a careful surgical process. You strip the interior first. You remove the wiring, the pipes, the fixtures. You weaken the supports. And then you bring it down in a controlled collapse so it does not damage the surrounding structures. I dismantled Brian and Melissa with the same precision. The first blow came from the insurance company. Brian had filed a claim for the Lexus LS, a total loss value of $80,000. He needed that money desperately. He was counting on it to pay his legal retainers. I met with the insurance adjuster, a man named Henderson, at the site. The car was still there, a gray monument in the dried mud. We had chipped away enough concrete to retrieve the personal effects, but the car itself was part of the foundation now. Mr. Carson Henderson said, tapping his clipboard, "This is unique." It is, I agreed. My client, Mr. Graves, claims this was an act of vandalism. He claims he is covered under comprehensive damage. I handed Henderson a file. It contained the police report, the court transcript, and the video footage from the neighbor's wildlife camera. Your client was trespassing on a posted hazardous industrial site, I said. He was operating the vehicle while intoxicated, and he was using the vehicle to facilitate the commission of a felony, specifically the theft of proprietary company data and embezzlement. Henderson read the file. He adjusted his glasses. He looked at the car, then back at the file. Felony activity voids the policy, he said simply. And the trespassing, well, that is negligence. We don't cover negligence of this magnitude. If you drive your car into a lake on purpose, we don't pay. If you drive your car into a concrete pour while drunk, we definitely don't pay. He ripped the claim form off his clipboard. Claim denied. We will be sending Mr. Graves a bill for the investigation costs. And Mr. Carson? Yes. If you want the car removed, we can't help you. It is his property. Or rather, it is his waste. Leave it, I said. It makes good fill. The denial of the insurance claim was the first domino. Without that $80,000, Brian defaulted on his car loan. Since the collateral was currently encased in 40 tons of rock, the bank called in the note immediately. They froze his personal accounts. Then came the countersuit. Allen filed it the day after the verdict. We sued Brian for the cost of the spoiled concrete, the delay in the project, the reputational damage, and the return of the $400,000 he had embezzled. Brian didn't even show up to the hearing. He couldn't afford a lawyer anymore. Sterling had dropped him the moment the check bounced. The judge granted us a default judgment. We garnished his wages. Not that he had any, since I had fired him and revoked his license to sell my properties. We put a lien on his condo. We seized his assets. The forensic accountants found the Vegas money. The girl, Chloe Davis, had disappeared the moment the money stopped flowing, but the trail remained. It was the final nail in the coffin of his relationship with Melissa. Melissa's demolition was quieter, but no less total. The divorce proceedings were short. My lawyer argued that her participation in the embezzlement constituted a breach of the marital fiduciary duty. The prenuptial agreement, which Brian had mocked her for signing years ago, had a bad acts clause. If one party engaged in criminal activity that damaged the other party's assets, they forfeited their claim to alimony. She got nothing. She lost the house. She lost the cars. She lost the status she had craved so desperately. She moved back in with her mother in a small, damp apartment on the south side of the city. I saw her only once during this time. It was at the office. She had come to collect a box of personal items. I was sitting at my desk, the real desk, not the one Brian had briefly occupied. The office was humming again. The phones were ringing. New contracts were being signed. The scandal had actually helped business. People wanted to hire the builder who was tough as nails. They figured if I could handle a crisis like that, I could handle a delayed shipment of lumber. Melissa stood in the doorway. She looked older. The spark was gone. "Jack," she said. I didn't look up from the blueprints I was reviewing. The new plaza project was moving into the framing phase. "You have your box?" I asked. "Yes." She hesitated. "Jack." I didn't know about the girl. In Vegas. I didn't know he was using me. I picked up a red pen and marked a correction on the drawing. The load-bearing wall was off by an inch. "Ignorance is not a defense, Melissa," I said. "You signed the checks. You cooked the books. You chose the partner. I was lonely, she whispered. You were always working. You were always with your concrete and your steel. I just wanted to feel something. I finally looked up. I looked at her with the same detached clinical assessment I used for a piece of drywall that had been water damaged. You wanted a foundation without doing the digging, I said. You wanted the view without the climb. And when you got bored, you tried to undermine the structure. Jack, please, is there any way? No, I said. There is no way. The site is cleared. The debris is removed. We are moving on. She stood there for a moment, tears running down her face. But they were not the pretty practiced tears of the courtroom. They were ugly, real tears of regret. She turned and walked away. I heard her heels clicking on the linoleum, fading into the distance. I went back to the blueprints. I corrected the wall. It was a simple fix. You just erase the error and draw the line where it is supposed to be. 6 months later, the Green Valley development was complete. The grass had grown in green and lush, covering the scars of the excavation. The trees had been replanted. The street was lined with beautiful modern homes, each one sold for over market value. I drove my truck down the smooth asphalt. It was evening. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of purple and bruised orange. I pulled into the driveway of Lot 4. The house was magnificent. It was a sprawling interplay of glass and cedar cantilevered over the ravine. It was the best thing I had ever built. The lines were clean. The angles were sharp. It looked like it had grown out of the hill. I had not sold this one. I had kept it. I parked the truck and got out. The air was crisp. I walked up the path past the landscape garden. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The house was empty. No furniture. Just vast open spaces and the smell of new paint and polished wood. I walked through the living room, my footsteps echoing on hardwood. I walked into the kitchen with its marble island and the floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the city lights. It was perfect. It was silent. It was mine. I walked to the door that led to the garage. I opened it and flipped the switch. The fluorescent lights flickered on, humming to life. The garage was a cavernous space. 3 bays, high ceilings, and the floor. The floor was a masterpiece. It was a single, uninterrupted slab of polished gray concrete, smooth as glass, cool to the touch. I had finished it myself. I had ground it down, polished it, and sealed it until it shone like a dark mirror. I walked to the center of the room. This was the spot. I stood exactly where the Lexus had been. I looked down at the floor. You couldn't see anything, of course. The car was feet below, encased in the subslab, buried under layers of aggregate and steel and fresh cement. It was part of the geology now. I stood there, and I let my mind drift back to that night. I closed my eyes. I could hear the rain again, the relentless drumming on the hood of my jacket, the smell of wet clay and diesel. I remembered walking down the ramp. I remembered the flash of lightning. In the courtroom, Alan had argued that I couldn't see them. The expert, Dr. Thorne, had testified that the tint and the rain made visibility 0. The jury had believed it. It was the scientific truth, the logical truth. But memory is not scientific. I opened my eyes and looked at the gray floor. I remembered the lightning flash. It was brief, less than a second. But in that second, the world had been illuminated with a stark electric clarity. I had seen them. I had seen Brian's head thrown back in ecstasy. I had seen Melissa's hands tangled in his hair. I had seen their faces, and they had seen me. For a fraction of a second, our eyes had met. I saw the recognition in Brian's eyes, the widening of his pupils, the sudden transition from pleasure to terror. He knew I was there. He knew I was watching. I had lied. I stood alone in my empty garage and acknowledged the lie. I had stood before a judge and a jury and sworn that I saw only a dark shape. I had built a defense on the premise of ignorance. But I knew. I walked over to the wall and ran my hand along the smooth drywall. Does a lie matter? In construction, we have a term called permissible tolerance. No wall is perfectly straight. No floor is perfectly level. There is always a margin of error. As long as the error is within the tolerance, the building stands. If you obsess over microscopic perfection, you will never build anything. The lie was my permissible tolerance. They had broken the covenant. They had stolen the money. They had defiled the marriage. They had trespassed on the land. They had introduced chaos into a system that required order. When I saw them that night, I didn't see people. I saw a structural failure. I saw a weak point that threatened to bring down everything I had worked for. And when you find a weak point, you reinforce it. You fill the void. You pour the concrete. I walked back to the center of the garage. I tapped the toe of my boot against the floor. It made a solid, dull sound. Brian was down there. Not physically. We had cut him out like a tumor, but his ghost was down there. His pride, his arrogance, his Lexus. It was all part of the fill. The house sat on top of his failure. It was the most stable foundation in the city. I took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of the sealer. Some might call it vengeance. I called it renovation. I turned off the lights. The garage plunged into darkness. I walked back into the house. I went to the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water from the tap. The water was cold and clean. I walked to the window and looked out at the city. The lights were twinkling like diamonds on black velvet. Somewhere out there, Brian was sleeping on a friend's couch, probably dreaming of the money he almost had. Somewhere, Melissa was staring at a cracked ceiling in a cheap apartment, wondering where it all went wrong. They were still in the zero cycle, stuck in the mud, digging holes they couldn't climb out of. I took a sip of water. I was done with the dirt. I was done with the digging. The storm had passed. The concrete had cured. The house was built. I set the glass down on the counter. It made a soft click. I was ready for the next project. I turned away from the window and walked into the quiet, peaceful dark of my home. The silence was not empty. It was heavy. It was solid. It was the silence of a man who had poured his own destiny and waited for it to harden. And it was flawless.